Hello, and welcome back with the Grouchy Historian. We're now in our 6th video review of AP American history, covering the early 20th century from 1890 to 1945. An amazing amount of history packed into a single chapter. So I hope you're ready. Hang on. Here we go. So as we left off in our last video, we had entered what was called the Progressive Era, where there was a pushback, as it were, to the so-called Gilded Age, the era of the robber baron and laissez-faire economics, where the progressives, which is we'll just call them an alliance of middle-class establishment politicians and other reformers, decided that they were going to reform the capitalist economy of the United States while still keeping it in place. This was, of course, exacerbated by a series of what were called muckrakers, what we would call investigative journalists today, that exposed the dark side of the American economy. If you've ever read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, it was probably the epitome of these muckrakers in a fictional form, a very dismal and grim story of workers in the Chicago meat industry trying to survive the hazards and the harsh life of a factory worker. So this, of course, reached its zenith, as it were. Teddy Roosevelt was the first of the great progressive presidents. Teddy was well known as a trust buster, a title he wore proudly. He was succeeded in the presidency by William Taft, who essentially kept his policies going, but it was really Woodrow Wilson, that wascally wabbit, Woodrow Wilson, who was probably the epitome of a progressive president who reshaped the American Constitution probably more than nearly any president in history. 2 significant amendments to the Constitution were championed and passed during Woodrow Wilson. The first was the 16th Amendment that allowed for an income tax. Up until this point, most of the government had almost exclusively been funded by tariffs on imports. Wilson decides that he wants to have a progressive income tax, and but of course the original Constitution did not allow for a direct income tax. It was always a proportional income tax or some other tax that was not directly pointed at individuals. Wilson changes the Constitution to allow a direct income tax. More importantly, I think, although the income tax, yeah, we all know what that's like these days, was Wilson changed the Constitution from the state selection of senators, right? Up until 1913 and the passage of the amendment that allowed the direct election of senators, senators had always been chosen by the state legislatures. This was intended by the founders as a means to give the states more say in the federal government because they were the ones that picked the senators. Wilson decided that this was patently unfair, open to fraud, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's gone so well since then that he got a constitutional amendment passed to allow the direct election of senators. However, I think more importantly for the United States is dragged more or less kicking and screaming onto the world stage with the beginning of World War I. Now, World War I began in 1914. It was another one of those European wars that Americans had decided after the Revolutionary War to definitely stay out of. However, because of the telegraph, new technologies such as airplane, submarines, machine guns, rifles, the war quickly, and of course you have worldwide empires at war with each other, the war quickly becomes a global war. And the U.S. cannot necessarily stay neutral as U.S. merchant shipping, going back all the way to the Napoleonic Wars, remember that, become prey more for the Germans than the British this year. By this point, Wilson is supporting the British and French against the Germans. The U.S. is alarmed by German militarism and the German attempt to overrun France. And the U.S. more or less tries to stay neutral, but a couple of events in 1917 drag America into the war. The first, of course, is unrestricted submarine warfare. Up until this point, with a few exceptions, the Germans had always allowed merchant ships. They had stopped the merchant ships They had allowed the sailors to take to the lifeboats, and then they had sunk the merchant ships. In early 1917, the British had gotten pretty good at anti-submarine warfare, so the submarines no longer gave any sort of warning or notice. If they saw a merchant ship that they determined was not German, German or Austrian, which there weren't any, they sank it. The other thing the Germans did, in an incredibly stupid diplomatic blunder, is they sent a telegram known as the Zimmermann telegram to the Mexican government, trying to encourage the Mexican government to come in on the German side with the promise of the return, should they be victorious, of the territory taken from Spain taken from Mexico in the Mexican War. The British decode this message, pass it on to Wilson, who promptly uses it, as well as the threat of submarine warfare to American commerce, to bring about a declaration of war against Germany. Now, the U.S. was spectacularly unprepared for World War II. The last true U.S. Army combat experience had been chasing Mexican bandits along the Texas border. The U.S. had no air force, had no modern weaponry. Almost all of the weaponry provided to the U.S. forces during World War I was provided by the British or the French. However, the U.S. does have 2 million troops, which make the difference in the war. The U.S. is master of improvisation. They do at least have a small professional army that is able to quickly expand, and the U.S. makes the difference to ultimately win the war in the fall offensives of 1918. However, we also see again the dark side of what would become the total wars of the 20th century, as Wilson starts to curb some civil liberties and make the first genuine use of propaganda to further the war effort. Now, once the Germans sue for an armistice on November 11th, 1918, the date of Veterans Day, fun fact, Wilson decides that because of America's influence and America's troops that help in the war, that he is going to remake global relations with the League of Nations, the first attempt to form a global body to prevent war and offer a forum for handling diplomatic disputes. However, the U.S. Senate, which of course constitutionally has the job of ratifying any treaties, doesn't ratify the League of Nations, and the U.S. in fact does not join. Even though Wilson is there at the peace negotiations, the British and French essentially dictate the terms of the peace to the Germans, blaming them entirely for beginning the war, which of course history has shown is patently unfair. But they do this in order to impose large reparations on the Germans and try to justify the huge sacrifice of the war that essentially wiped out an entire generation of young men across Europe. What they end up doing is sowing the seeds for World War II. Of course, the U.S. Wants to have a return to normalcy, as the term goes, and the 20s, called the Roaring 20s, offers the ability of the Americans to once again turn back inward on themselves and forget about all of the sacrifice and suffering of World War I. The rise of the automobile, now truly a means of transportation for the middle class, with Henry Ford and his automobile production line, and the radio and the creation of motion pictures, truly changes American society and culture. We now have the beginnings of the era of mass media. Again, women get the vote with the amendment in 1920 to give women the vote, and they become more involved in society and politics. Again, America becomes disillusioned with World War I. They began to believe that World War I, America's involvement and entry into World War I, was all a fraud by greedy arms manufacturers to just make a profit. But it creates what's known as the lost generation. These are the veterans of World War I, many of whom suffer from PTSD, which of course was undiagnosed and virtually untreated at the time, and they become disillusioned with World War I. This is going to have a great deal of effect when we get into the 1930s and the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy. And of course, there is the great experiment in Prohibition to ban alcohol, which leads to the tremendous rise of organized crime. This is the era of the gangster, Al Capone, and the rise of organized crime. Of course, Prohibition is shown to be a huge failure and is repealed in 1933. Of course, all of this economic activities, an unprecedented boom, has a negative effect, we'll call it, on the stock market as the rampant speculation and margin buying, where you would buy, let's say, $100 of stock, but you only put up $10 of your own stock because you assumed that $100 of stock was going to be worth $200, and then you could pay back the money you actually spent to buy the stock. Not so much. That leads to the great stock market crash of 1929. The Hoover administration does not act quickly enough to restore confidence in the economy, and they bungle the bonus army, which was a bunch of World War I veterans that went to Washington, D.C. When World War I ended, the veterans were promised a bonus for serving in the army that they would be paid in 1945. They decided they might want their bonus a little earlier since, of course, everybody was losing their homes, losing their jobs. There was about 25% unemployment, and they marched on D.C. Hoover sent out the army to disperse them. Didn't really play well over radio, motion pictures, newspapers, or in American society. Which led to the election of 1932, probably one of the most important elections in American history. Franklin Roosevelt wins and starts to jumpstart the economy, tried to jumpstart the economy with a wide variety of government programs driven by Keynesian economic theory. This basically, in a nutshell, is the theory that government spending can spur economic growth. It's really somewhere between sort of a smorgasbord and a shotgun blast of various programs designed to give people jobs, to help spur economic activity. Some are successful, some are not. He also introduces a massive regulatory engine to try to manage the economy, including the National Labor Relations Boards, the Security and Exchange Commission, and most of all, he introduces the first, we'll just call it government-backed insurance program called Social Security. Now, he did experience some pushback to this. The Supreme Court overruled a number of his New Deal policies as unconstitutional, which they basically were. FDR threatened to pack the courts, we've heard that term again, haven't we, in order to put enough justices on here that he felt would rule his programs constitutional. Of course, at this point, the Democrats pretty much ruled all of government, the Senate, the House, and the presidency, but his own party pushed back against this threat to pack the courts, and he backed down. Historians, particularly economic historians, have given sort of mixed results to the New Deal. Let's be brutally frank. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. What ended the Great Depression was the United States build-up and entry into World War II. I think that's pretty much, other than the hardcore left, the view of what ended the Depression was World War II. Not necessarily how you would want to end an economic depression, but it certainly had that effect. It was scattered, and many parts of it were intended to be temporary, yet here we are almost 100 years later, and they're still in place, for better or for worse. Of course, the Depression became a global depression, and although the League of Nations had various attempts at arms control, primarily in the arena of naval power and outlawing war, the flaws of the Versailles Treaty, particularly the grievances that it engendered among the German people, almost guaranteed another European war. Some historians have called this period of World War I and World War II the modern 30 Years' War for Germany, because almost immediately after the First World War ended, you can definitely see the seeds of fascism, militarism, and the rise of Hitler and the Nazis leading to another world war. In fact, the Great Depression leads to Nazi Germany. Hitler was elected. Let's be clear, he was elected to power by the German people. He immediately repudiates the Versailles Treaty, begins a massive armaments build up in Germany, begins to rebuild German industry, and prepare for a new war in Europe. Britain and France do nothing to stop Hitler when they could have stopped him very easily. The bloodletting, the loss of treasure, from World War I makes the British and French extremely reluctant to confront Hitler when he was still weak and early in power. Their shameful conduct at Munich, handing over Czechoslovakia to the Germans, almost guaranteed a Second World War when the Germans invade Poland on September 1st, 1939. Again, another European war breaks out, which quickly becomes a global war. The US, not interested. FDR tries to keep the US officially neutral while providing as much aid as possible to Britain and eventually the Soviet Union when Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941. However, Roosevelt is at least aware of the potential danger that Hitler poses and begins a slow buildup of the military, partly as a jobs program, partly as a means of defending the Western Hemisphere, as if. And the US begins a slow buildup of the military, particularly after the Germans overrun Western Europe, defeating France in 6 weeks, something they couldn't do in 4 years of World War I. But because of the German integration of the tank, the airplane, the radio, and the truck into warfare in a completely new style of warfare called blitzkrieg, which the Germans never called it blitzkrieg, they overrun Western Europe in 6 weeks. And of course, the Japanese have also rearmed, built up probably the best carrier navy in the world, a huge army. They invade China in 1937, which sets them on a collision course with the United States. And as the Chinese take advantage of Hitler's victory in Europe to take over French Indochina, they soon set their eyes on the Dutch East Indies, the country of Indonesia, which has a large amount of oil needed for the Japanese war machine, as well as the British colonies of Malaya, Hong Kong, and inevitably the Philippines. The US is still totally surprised by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 and enters the war. Initially, FDR only got a declaration of war against the Japanese. Interesting question, if Hitler had never declared war on the US on December 11th, would the US have eventually gone to war with Germany? Probably, but it might have been a lot tougher political battle as the US populace and public opinion was totally focused on Japan at the time to have gained entry into the War of Europe. But Hitler solved that problem for him. So World War II begins. Now, of course, the AP US history quickly just fast forwards past most of World War II, which again, as they fast forward past most of World War I. As a military historian, this breaks my heart, but it's a survey course, so they quickly zipped through it. However, I think it's important to get at least some sense of the timeline here, because even though the US came into the war in 1941, we were totally unprepared. The Allies were losing the war through most of 1942. It's not really until late 1942 that the US is able to flex its almost unheard of industrial might to start producing the tanks, planes, ships, beans, bullets, boots, everything necessary to equip a global army, a two-ocean navy, and a war-winning air force that is able to take the war to the Axis powers. In 1942, the Axis powers are really at the high tide, but there's strategically no way they can win the war. They are operationally very successful. They almost succeed in seizing the Russian oil fields, which might have significantly damaged Russia's ability to continue the war. But there's really no way for the Germans and the Japanese to defeat the British and the US. However, it does take the US most of 1942 to gear up for war production, to start getting the first of what soon becomes a multi-million man army, and most importantly, to decide what to do. Now, the Allies quickly agree on a Germany-first strategy, assuming, quite correctly, that Hitler is the larger threat. So they decided to focus as much of their production and manpower capacity to defeating the Germans, although the US eventually ends up taking the lead on the Pacific War and beating up on the Japanese at the same time. In 1943, the US nears peak production. Once again, the US is now equipping not only itself, but its British and Russian allies, and the turn of the tide against the Axis now becomes clear as the Allies begin the first of their great offensives, first to clear the Germans out of North Africa, then to invade Sicily and Italy as they prepare for 1944 and the eventual return to Northwest Europe with the D-Day invasion. By 1944, the US military has become the dominant world power. Not really understood because a lot of history study the European War and the Pacific War in isolation. You really have to look at the war as a global war to understand the staggering, really staggering military power that the US had mobilized by 1944. About 9 days after the invasion of D-Day, the US sent out the world's largest fleet to conduct an amphibious invasion halfway across the Pacific in the Marianas Islands, the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. In June 1944, the US launched 2 simultaneous huge offensive with hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, thousands of airplanes, almost simultaneously. Of course, by this time, the Allies, it's only a matter of time before the Allies achieve victory. In 1945, the Germans, after intense fighting, through the Normandy invasion, the race across Western Europe, the Battle of the Bulge, into the final defeat of Germany. One of the things the Allies did in early 1943 was adopt a war policy of unconditional surrender. There would be no more Versailles Treaty. Germany would be defeated, its army vanquished, and the country occupied. Ditto with Japan. When the war ended in 1945, Germany had been essentially divided between the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. More on that on the next video. In the Pacific theater, the Japanese were a much tougher nut to crack. They were not likely to surrender. In spite of the horrible revisionist history, the Japanese were in no mood to make peace in 1945. They fully expected and anticipated the US to invade Japan, which would have more or less led to the annihilation of the Japanese people. The invention and engineering of the atomic bombs provided a war-winning weapon, we'll just call it what it was, that finally brought the Japanese to peace terms, and World War II ended on September 1st, 1945. Make no mistake, absent the use of the atomic bombs, the United States would have had to invade Japan, which would have caused millions of casualties. If you ever talk, they're all gone now, sadly, but if you ever read the recollections of GIs, troops in the Pacific, most of them did not expect to survive the invasion of Japan. That's just the way it was. The atomic bombs, although they were brutal weapons, saved more lives than they took. You can argue that. I wouldn't. So now we get to 1945. The Allies are victorious. Europe's devastated. And now we start to see that the world's most unlikely alliance, the alliance of the democratic Western allies of Britain, France, the United States, with the communist allies of the Soviet Union, begins to break down and bring about what is going to be called the Cold War. Stay tuned. That's our next video.